this should be information that underlines what we need to do to move this country forward. Well, hello, everybody. It's David Leis, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, the live edition. And boy, do we have a program today on July 9, 2006, the year of our Lord. We're going to talk about, well, the Canadian dream and housing affordability. This is one of those key policy files that we've got to get right in this country, not to mention other nations. So we've got a big report. We've got an A-team panel joining us. So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for our regulars like Prairie. And, it's interesting. We've got a lot of great supporters in the audience. And honestly, you guys make our day. Cracker Crumbs says, welcome guests and everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't. Another informative session hosted by a favorite David. Well, thank you so much. That's very, very kind of you. And interesting, very sad and depressing to see the state that Canada's in now. Well, what do you agree? Do you agree with that comment? I mean, obviously, we've got a challenging time in this country. Coming out of July 1st, though, Canada Day, we've got lots to be grateful for. And at Frontier, obviously, we're raising some money, so participate in that campaign. We're here to serve Canadians with good public policy. And I think there's lots to be proud of our country. And there's also the opportunity to be clear-eyed about the kind of challenges we face. It's interesting. If memory serves me correctly, on July the 9th, 1783, John Graves Simcoe, do you remember that name, banned slavery into what was called Upper Canada. Isn't that something? Banned slavery. We were at the forefront in this country of banning slavery. So when people say otherwise, you know the facts. So this is an incredible day as we talk about housing affordability, and we appreciate your comments. And I want to just highlight a few comments and then go to some headlines before we dive into the topic of housing affordability. Quote, we absolutely need more commentaries like this. True hard facts. Canada needs to learn the history of Canada first. This should all be taught in schools and universities. Keep up the awesome work, David. Much appreciated. And that is from an earlier person who just commented. So thank you very much, Cracker Crumbs. That's a mouthful. Absolutely love this discussion. Much gratitude to both of you for your time. That's from Heidi Walton. And I think that's the conversation that came out this Tuesday with, of course, our friend Conrad Black, talking about the importance of history, knowing our identity and how that informs public policy and where we can take this nation. So that was a great interview. Always love listening to Conrad Black. Thanks for conducting this interview and sharing it. And that's from Daryl Nister. Thank you very much for those kind comments. Hey, in terms of headlines, lots of interesting stories, including a trade surplus that Canada racked up this year. That surplus is some $4.2 billion in May alone. And a lot of that surplus relates to, what is it again? Oh, yes, natural resources, including oil and gas, and of course, potash. There's a lot of key ingredients that go into the whole world of fertilizers. So Canada's the key source of that. We also had announcements, a flurry of media announcements. We'll see if anything comes out of it. But one of them was, of course, buying German submarines. And they won a German consortium won the contract for a defense engagement. It's worth several $100 billion over the life of that contract, beating out a South Korean firm. So is that part of Canada's real rebuilding of our military? Is that going to actually result in results? And then in other news, the Liberals shut down the debate over the whole issue of a federal bailout of condominiums. And we'll come back to this in our discussion because there's certainly a lot of questions related to ethics and the whole use of public monies for this. Another story, we've got a lot of announcements regarding pipelines and the southerly route kind of along the corridor of the Trans Mountain pipeline going to Delta, in this case, not Burnaby. But the interesting thing is that the federal tanker ban remains against any tankers going along the north coast of British Columbia. So what does that mean if we can't get that pipeline done, but a southerly one is supposedly going to be underway? In other news, it was with sadness that there was some 5,000 parties that came out to honor the slain Montreal police officer, and we certainly salute that officer for paying that price for being killed in the line of duty. We also have an interesting case that we continue to monitor. This relates to the Cowichan land decision in British Columbia, specifically in Richmond, BC. A judge's refusal to reopen the Cowichan case has really sent what some would argue is a chilling message to BC landowners. And this is certainly one of the variables that we'll pick up on in our discussion, where the court basically said, and this was from BC Supreme Court Justice Jane Young, who talked about that landowners cannot rely on the court to give notice regarding future Aboriginal land claims. So this is a very important story as it unfolds, and I have not had an opportunity to read that recent analysis or pardon me, decision, but we will certainly be in touch with our analysis going forward. Another MP has left the Conservative Party, and this is in the case of the House of Commons. This MP will be moving to the Senate for an appointment, and so we'll see what party that MP associates with in the Senate. It remains to be seen. We do not know. Then we have a very interesting post from Blacklock's Reporter, one of our favorite news sources that focuses on original documents. And this is a fascinating case where Industry Minister Melanie Joly's department, in an access to information memo, contemplates, quote, legal action against users on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social media sites if suspects of spreading, quote, false and misleading information. So this heavily censored 35-page memo did not explain what action federal lawyers would take, but this, quote, strategy seeks to uphold the integrity of and public trust in government information. So what does that mean? This is certainly a significant flag. Also, in other news, despite 51st state rhetoric, Canadians open to relocating for work and tax breaks in healthcare, according to a recent study that was announced from the University of Calgary. So it's a number of factors are enabling Canadians to look at moving to the United States, and that continues. And then in other news, we've got the GDP rebounds a little bit. So there was, you may recall that a month and a half ago, there was a lot of talk about a, quote, technical recession. But Canada's economy continues, despite more positive numbers, continues to be at a kind of a stagnating level. So that's part of the discussion that's happening among economists. What do you think? Is Canada's economy moving forward much? Another interesting news at Six Nations, First Nation has called out a Brantford, Ontario councillor who sees land acknowledgements as virtue signaling, as really not being appropriate in council meetings. And that was by a gentleman there in Brantford, Ontario, saying, I don't believe in land acknowledgements. And in other news, the feds have made additional announcements about 3 northern projects fast-tracked under Building Canada Act, and you can that relates to a highway, deep water report, and a nuclear waste storage. And I believe those have been projects under consideration for quite some time, but they were announced. And we also had an interesting U.S. indictment of Bushnoi gang members. This is a major gang around the world, but particularly in Canada and the United States. And that is for trafficking and violence. And it's interesting that the FBI has been leading that effort. And also another report that was just released by the Frontier Center, and this was led by Scott McGregor, a senior fellow at Frontier, pointing out that Canada's Pacific ports are undersecured and citing a lot of issues regarding a lack of inspection, particularly for outgoing traffic And I encourage you to look at that. That has certainly made headlines in media across the country, and it's a very important issue. And I think that's the some of the headlines. There's a lot going on. I want to turn to the issue of the audience, and that is we took a straw poll. Pardon me. Before I dive into there, I had the pleasure of also celebrating as we bring on, of course, Wendell Cox and Joel Kotkin, our colleagues there from the United States. We wanted to offer our word of celebration to the 250th birthday celebration of July the 4th with our friends and neighbors of the United States. And I had the pleasure of attending the ambassador's residence in Ottawa. And there he is, Ambassador Pete Hoekstra. And I had the chance to meet with him and hobnob with some 1,500 of his closest friends. But it was really quite an honor to be there in celebration and connect with a large number of people that care about that relationship and also care about Canada as well. So in any case, I wanted to highlight that. But I want to go back to our audience, and that is we have an interesting straw poll with, I believe we had over 1,000 respondents. Has the Canadian dream of owning a home disappeared? And the response was very interesting. 83% yes for many Canadians. No, it's still achievable, 3%. It depends on where you live at 7%, and something needs to change fast. So it's obviously not a scientific poll, but it was a very interesting one because, yes, you're all right. It depends on where you live in this country. But yes, for many Canadians in key markets, housing affordability is not possible. So I am very excited about today's agenda today. We're going to talk about many things, including the report, the key highlights that are from the 22nd edition of the Demographia International Housing Affordability Index. This is done through the leadership of Wendell Cox, who will be joining us shortly. And this is with Chapman University, represented by Joel Kotkin. But we have this report, and it's got significant findings. So when it comes to our agenda today, we're going to go through not only its key findings, but talking about this report and what is affordability? How did we get here? What are the consequences on the middle class, our democracy, among many, many other issues? This is a critical file. And what are the policies that need to change as we look to solutions? We can turn this mess around, but we need to understand what is the origins of this problem. So that's a big agenda. So I am delighted to introduce our A-team panel. I want to introduce Joel Kotkin, who's the presidential appointee at Chapman University at the Center for Demographics. And a warm welcome, Joel.
Nice to be here.
And of course, I have Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, and he's our Vice President of Research at Frontier, and he's a regular. So great to see you, Marco.
Good afternoon.
And I know that we may have some technical issues, so we'll see if Wendell Cox can join us for this discussion. Wendell has been a key leader in this report. I want to ask you, Joel, what would be the key finding from this year's report from your perspective? And then I'll turn to Marco.
Well, I think there are clearly at least two major points. One is that the housing affordability crisis is a international one, certainly in all the English-speaking parts of the world. United Kingdom, Australia, United States, New Zealand, and Canada. So I think that certainly has not changed. What is interesting is what causes this affordability crisis, or what happens in the places where it's worse. And it's almost universal that it has to do with planning regulations, which make it very, very difficult to build, particularly the housing that people want. I mean, I don't think you have a single family home bailout coming in Canada because those are what people want, and that is almost universal. Mm-hmm. And in the U.S., obviously, we're a very big country with a big population, and so we have parts of the U.S. that are quite affordable and parts of the U.S. that are impossibly unaffordable, as Wendell would put it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a great summary, Joel. And this is would you say this is frankly one of the most important policy issues in terms of being able to deal with affordability and living the Canadian slash American dream?
Well, I think it has to do, I would tie it to demographics. In other words, if young people cannot afford a home, they're not likely to get married, they're not likely to have children, and then you're going
Mhm,
to have this demographic crisis. Canada is actually, I think, is now losing population. Um, the attempt to solve it by just bringing in as many immigrants as you can obviously puts stresses on the housing system itself to start with.
mhm,
And fundamentally, if you have a country where people aren't going to have children, you're clearly going to decline.
mhm,
There's no way. We're never going to go back to the kind of, three, four, five kids in a family that was common in both our countries. But what do we do if we get to a point where 40% of women never have children?
mhm,
What do you see? And I've spent a good deal of time in Italy, and you can see what's happening there, which is just the oldest country in Europe. People can't find workers. There's very little economic vitality, even though it is, I think, the nicest country to visit
mhm,
in the world. But that's nevertheless, I think that the implications are terrible. The other big implication, which we're seeing more and more in the United States, is you now have a generation of young people who, having been indoctrinated in school, then go and face the world in which they actually can never grow up. They're sort of
mhm,
Peter Pan forever. Um, they never buy a house. They never have children. They never, in many cases, don't have a real career. Um, and that's the basis of the move to the left in not just the U.S. but in
mhm,
Canada and Australia, where, well, if I can't make it on my own and I can't build up my own equity, I'm going
mhm,
to let the government take care of it.
mhm.
And that is very powerful, and you can almost see a direct relationship to where things are unaffordable and how people vote politically,
Okay,
and,
very
and how many
fascinating.
children they have as
Yes,
well.
indeed. So housing is a seminal file. It has impacts on living out the Canadian American dream. And as you said, Joel, not only in terms of how people think, the culture, even how they vote. So it's a big deal. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Marco, what's your response? What's the key finding from your perspective on this report?
Um, well, as far as Canada is concerned, the report is quite revealing about a couple of things. One is that even though we say that we are in a housing crisis that is caused by external factors, our politicians keep telling us that this is a world phenomenon.
Hmm.
I think the report puts that one to bed. That it is an issue in Canada. It is worse in some places. It is better in many places, but it is not by and large a uniform issue across the world. And the extent to which it is driven by policy, not by external factors as we claim. In a country like Canada, where uh, a market like Edmonton and a market like uh, Vancouver can coexist,
Hmm.
it tells you that it is not caused by external factors, that is caused by local factors that are driven by policy, distribution of land, and a whole bunch of things that I'm
Hmm.
sure we're going to talk about. I'd like to sort of join Joel in his observation about demographics, because there are several different places in Canada that are losing population, but the places that are losing the most people are the provinces in which the housing issue is the worst, Ontario and British Columbia.
Hmm.
And what is worse, again, another sort of layer to compound this, is that it is young people by and large who are suffering the most
Hmm.
about this. In the most recent iteration of what is called the Happiness Index, Canada is 25th on the list. But if you only take people who are younger than 35, we drop down to about 75.
What did you just say there? We drop in a happy index? I mean, this is Canada we're talking about after all, down to 75 if we look at young people?
If we only take into account what young people declare themselves to be happy or not
Wow.
in the index, we drop 50 points straight away. And so that tells you something about the considerations of the younger generation in terms of their future.
So I don't mean to make light of this, but that's very sad. So let's just look at some of these key highlights from the report, some key findings here. I think there's a highlighted list here. But if we think of some key headlines here, Canada's housing affordability now is behind its peers, namely the United States and UK, even though they're quite bad. We're even worse in select markets like Vancouver, Toronto. Vancouver being the least affordable market in the world, and that's based on evidence in terms of these measurements of affordability. And just a reminder, the report examined 96 housing markets across 8 countries. And there's other points, and that is that there's some affordable markets, and one of them is Edmonton, relatively speaking, and some other select prairie cities, and also in Eastern Canada. So that's good. But the point is that we've got some real train wrecks of markets that, again, as Marco, you said, we're really adopting policies that have created, we've self-inflicted this pain on ourselves. And so one of the key things I want to talk about, Joel, then is land use.
Right.
Is that the key problem here? And what do we mean by that?
Well, land use is obviously the key thing. This has been Wendell's great contribution to this debate, which is, let's face it, the United States, Australia, Canada can't complain they don't have enough land. I mean, it's just, it's insane.
Mhm.
You fly, for instance, to Australia, which has very similar problems to Canada, and
Mhm.
you fly over from, let's say, from Brisbane down to Sydney or Melbourne, and you pass hundreds of miles of basically deserted coastal land. Okay, so obviously you want to preserve a great deal of that, but you certainly could build there. We have huge parts of the U.S. where very, very little can be built. People forget that, for instance, San Bernardino County, which is next to Los Angeles County, is the largest county in the continental United States.
Mhm.
It's enormous. It goes from about an hour from LA to basically the Arizona border. So, the land is there, and it wouldn't take an enormous amount of opening of land to change the whole dynamic. Jennifer Hernandez has done a lot of work in this area. She thinks a 1% increase in the amount of land made available for residential development in California would dramatically change the price and affordability issues. Um,
Wow.
and I'm sure that could be applied to Vancouver and
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
the Toronto area. So I mean, it's really a kind of an ideology that's become very deeply entrenched, particularly in the planning schools. Um, and there's many people in the real estate community who take advantage of it. For
Mhm.
instance, when the San Francisco Bay Area says we're going to have 90% of the growth on 4% of the land, well, if you own that 4% of the land, you're sitting pretty because you know that it's going to be worth a fortune. Look, we've made a lot of money in real estate here just from houses. As a friend of mine once said that a chimpanzee could make money in LA real estate, and many did. Um, and so I think that what we're seeing is that there's such a shortage of housing that if you own a house and particularly if you own it outright, you're guaranteed to be making lots of money every year.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, young people can't come in. So, for instance, California, which let's say this is somewhat prejudiced, it's probably the nicest place on the planet to live in many ways. Um, you in California, young people can't come here. We are almost at the bottom of attracting people from other states. The LA area actually lost foreign born residents in the last census.
Mhm.
So how screwed up can a policy be when what is a clearly an incredibly attractive place to live in on
Mhm.
many, on many vectors, um, that you people can't come here because they can't even conceive of coming here. When I moved to Southern California in the 1970s, if you met somebody who was from LA, you were shocked. Now, most of the people that my daughters have gone to school with are people whose families have been there and sometimes for 2 or 3 generations. So you're also doing something, and I don't know how to measure this, but the dynamism of the society
Mm.
begins to dial down
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
you don't have the new people coming in, so they're not challenging anything. You basically and the new people that you've been getting in recent years are not people who are going to buy houses and move ahead.
Mhm.
It was very different in Canada. Just for the audience's information, my wife is a Canadian from Montreal,
Mhm.
so we spent every summer up in Quebec. So I think that you know there's enormous potential in Canada, and
Mhm.
somehow it isn't being realized.
Mhm.
I think that housing is one of the major reasons why it isn't. Why are Canadians moving to the United States with our ogre president and all the various disadvantages? One of the reasons is the chance of making enough money to buy a house is still probably
Mhm.
better in the United States than it is in Canada.
Mhm. Indeed. So there's an awful lot that you've gone over there, Joel, but a key point is that in select jurisdictions, it's these
Right.
policies around land use that are creating a land value bubble. Like the
Yes.
land cost is shooting up. And that's why your housing cost is so darn expensive. I mean, and this is just replicated across so many jurisdictions. And there's this kind of planning philosophy that has infected local governments, select provinces to further regulate the land. So, I mean, if you look at so many of these markets, that's the biggest frustrations developers have beyond red tape, where it takes on average 10 years to get anything built. You can't find the land, and then it's not affordable, and then you can't build and create a price point that people can even buy. So, Marco, my question to you would be, when we look at Canada, why are we regulating land to such a degree when, in fact, the last time I checked, Canada was the second largest nation in the world?
There is barely 40 million of us in basically 10 million square kilometers. So, that's 4 people per square kilometer. That's not very much. There is no shortage of land out there, but the
Mhm.
land is not available to build because of government restrictions. And the restrictions are typically driven by this sort of a green ideology,
Mm.
who believes that if we build one more house, if we build one more facility somewhere, the world will come to an end. And that I'm not exaggerating. There are people who actually believe that. And so the politicians are pushed into sort of restricting the land. So when we talk about land use, it's not that there's no land to be used, is that it is being restricted. And when you restrict the land, just like you would restrict any other product or commodity, the price goes up incredibly. And that is caused by regulation. And then that is on top of, as you alluded, of a whole host of other regulations that
Mhm.
make building, if you are able to find the land, make it building even more expensive. In Canada, for example, the rules about building, on the average, have increased the cost of a home by about 27,000 years, just 27,000 years, $27,000, excuse me,
Mhm.
in just the last couple of years. But on average, across the country, a someone buying a new home would pay somewhere around $83,000 uh, over the price of whatever it would cost to build a house, just to pay for the regulations, right? And so
Mhm.
you put those two together, and that's largely the reason why we are where we
Mhm.
are.
Unbelievable. So I want to bring up a table because I'll need your help, Joel and Marco, to understand this. And that relates to how we define affordability here, because there's a real practical measurement that Wendell Cox has outlined here, where we have a kind of a median multiple. And that basically means the median house price divided by the median household income. You come up with measures of affordability here. So you have three and below means affordable to obviously 3.1 to 4 is moderately unaffordable, but that's the zone that we want to be in. And then we have impossibly unaffordable at 9.0 and over. So, Joel, as you look at this, why is this such a good measurement of affordability? Because there's a lot of talk about, well, this is affordable and this isn't. But to me, this seems like a really practical insight in defining what affordability is. Or what do you say?
Well, look, it's the relationship between median family income and median house price. So, and what's really interesting and what's changed is there used to be, at least in the United States, an enormous difference between, let's say, what you made if you lived in South Carolina or if you lived in New York City or you lived in Los Angeles. That that difference has been shrinking. So
Mhm.
what that means is the people in the, let's say, in New York or LA don't have an income that can afford a house. And we even see this even within the, let's say, the state of California. LA and sometimes is actually worse than the Bay Area, even though Bay Area houses are more expensive because Bay Area salaries are higher. And we have in Southern California, we particularly LA, we have the worst combination of low salaries and high housing prices. Um, and so, if you want to know why the next mayor of LA may be a socialist, um, that's a good place to start.
Very good. Interesting. A lot of comments from the audience, and I really appreciate this. One example is from Chris McLaughlin, who says, as Desiree Fixler says, the key to economic prosperity is low taxation, low regulation, and an abundance of cheap energy. And I would say add to that is affordable housing. Is that a fair comment, Marco?
Sure, and affordable housing is kind of emanating from those three things, if you really think about it. Um, People we have been socialized into believing in the North American dream. Um, the American dream is the Canadian dream in that sense that people will be able, if they work hard, if they apply themselves, they would be able to afford a nice home for their families. That is not longer the case in very many jurisdictions, but Vancouver being the worst. So if you are a young family in Vancouver and you have more or less the average income in the lower mainland, and you save 10% of that income in order to be able to put together a sum of money that amounts to 20% of the price of the average house in
Mhm.
Vancouver, it will take you 27 years.
I beg your
Just
pardon? 27 years.
27 years just to put the down payment together.
That is
So,
crazy. And then you could
so
have your first child.
or seven in 27 years for some of us. Um, but the reality is, therefore, it illustrates the impossibility or the near impossibility for the average person to buy the average house.
Mhm.
And we know that the average house in Vancouver is over $1 million, right? And so this is exactly the fact that, and that on top of the fact that they pay exorbitant prices for
Mhm.
energy and everything else. So it makes the lower mainland not the most desirable place to live.
Okay. So to be clear, we're talking today about a very important report that was released this past month by the Frontier Center and Chapman University called the Demographia Affordable Housing Report. And it talks about these issues and why in select markets of housing affordability is highly unaffordable. In fact, it's far out of reach, as Marco just said, for many younger people. And it's a travesty. This is a policy train wreck. It is. Would it be fair to say, Marco and Joel, that this is truly a crisis in a number of markets? This is a situation where housing is just simply out of reach now for almost everybody. Is that your take on it, Joel?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's certainly a crisis, and it's one that's also has impact on corporate location decisions, where jobs are created.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the parallel that I would use is that you take California, which I think again has everything going for it, naturally speaking, and Texas, which doesn't have everything going for it, naturally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And if you spent a summer day in Houston, you know what I'm talking about. But in Texas, developers build for the market. They build, generally if people want inner city condos, they build that. If they want to build in the exurbs, they do that. So what happens in the market, let's say like Austin, because I'm also a fellow at the University of Texas Civitas Institute. What happens is Texans overbuild all the time and the prices go down. Well, that's how a market system should work. But we have in, let's say, California, we have an ideology which, as you described earlier, single family homes are bad. People should live in condos. They should take the bus to work. I don't know, and yet, we're in a state where we charge people extra if they build in an area where transit is weak. 3% of the people in California take transit to work. So why are we building something? And it's just really the triumph of ideology, green ideology, urbanist ideology over what people actually want. And long term, there's going to be enormous political ramifications, which I think we're already beginning to see, certainly in this country.
Right on. Marco, your comment?
Absolutely, I would entirely agree with Joel. The example in Canada is Edmonton. Edmonton, up until a few years ago, was not a very easy place to find housing. It took somewhere between 2 and 3 years to get permits and so forth. And in the last couple of years, they have made tremendous efforts to reduce all the regulations and the permits in order to build, and they have managed now to have among the largest cities one of the lowest scores in the Demographia index, precisely because of it. And Alberta is a particularly good case, Edmonton being the better one, because that kind of effort is being pushed across the board in most of the municipal jurisdictions in Canada. Alberta last year produced about 25% of the new houses started in Canada with only 12% of the population. And so it's a record, by the way, since we started sort of putting these kinds of numbers together. Conversely, in Ontario, where the vast majority of the population in a single province exists, you would think that they would also be building at a fast rate and more houses, right? But the reality is the opposite. Ontario, year to year, has essentially slowed down by about a third of the number of houses that they produce from the previous year. And this is in the middle of what we acknowledge to be a crisis. The federal government has recently announced that they would spend $46 billion trying to kickstart the building of new houses. But the problem isn't that the federal government is giving or not giving money. The problem is that we are feeding the problem even more because we're essentially building new houses with the excessive regime of regulation. So if you continue to pay more and more and more because of regulation, you're essentially trying to fill out a pool with a drinking glass. Right?
Okay.
You're never going to catch up.
Well said. So there are some positives in Canada. And I know there are some very positives, like Cleveland in the United States is one example. I think that's the most affordable city in terms of housing in the United States. But we have a situation here where it's not a surprise that people are moving to parts of those affordable housing markets, like Winnipeg or parts of Eastern Ontario, Eastern Canada. Pardon me. Edmonton is certainly much improved. So those are things to celebrate and learn from as they try to cut their red tape to be able to open up land. You've got to look at every one of those specific markets for details. But the point is that we've also got some train wrecks. And I want to bring up a slide here when it comes to the affordability ranking. I believe it's figure 12 here, or sorry, affordability ranking for the Canadian markets here. Um, I think that one's available here. So we have some markets here. We see that the trend line is it continues to go up here from 1971, where it was 1.5. Can you imagine that? And that's a time where you could buy a house easily. You could get that starter home. It wouldn't take you, like, what did you say, Marco, 27 years to get your first down payment.
Yeah.
This is something where you could definitely save up and get that first house. And then it just kind of started going off the rails when you had urban planning boundaries really entrenching, that kind of philosophy in land use in those key markets. And so then you get to in 2024 at 8.1. It's declined moderately, but it's still at a crisis level when you think of 3 being affordable, and 7.2 is definitely in that high zone. So this is the kind of the trend line that was tabled in this report. And I want to just look at the whole issue of down payments. If you look at figure 12, there's an interesting graph here, Joel, that illustrates the years of savings required for a down payment. And this is kind of picking up on Marco's comment here, where you've got the average in the middle, where it takes maybe about 6 years to save up given people's incomes. And then you look at these other cities of red zones. What does this mean to you, Joel?
Well, what it is, frankly, the basis of a very unequal society with very little upward mobility. And again, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, San Diego, no surprise, California has some of the most extreme regulations on housing of any place. And these places have incredibly high levels of unaffordability. And I just think that what we're doing is we're crushing a whole generation of young people, forcing them to choose between living a renter lifestyle for the rest of their lives, never having any assets, or moving. I mean, people don't move to Dallas, Texas because the weather's better or the scenery is prettier or or anything like that. You move to Dallas, Texas because you can go and you can buy a house and you can start the road towards adulthood and towards becoming somebody who has some assets. If you live in California, this is very true also, particularly in parts of New York City, the chances of buying something almost are minuscule. And at the same time, you're also competing, and I saw one of your people asked a question about this, you're competing with capital that's coming from all over the world, particularly places like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. I think in Canada, you could say definitely Toronto and Vancouver. In Australia, Melbourne, and particularly Sydney. These are cities that attract international investors, and they are also a factor in making housing much more unaffordable. And then lastly, you have the movement by some of the large investment banks to buy up, at least in this country, to buy up single family homes and rent them out. And that also reduces the supply. So, I mean, this is really a crisis, really almost you can almost call it a crisis of capitalist civilization. The success of capitalism is based, I think, almost besides productivity and all those things, but it's based on the fact that people feel the system works for them.
Hmm.
And what we're seeing in the United States, and I'm doing a lot of work on this right now, is there's an increasing number of people, particularly young people, who feel that they will never buy a house. They'll never really have the things that their parents had. And therefore, they're looking for some sort of solution coming from on high, like Mayor Mondani in New York or or Gavin Newsom here in California. And this destroys the whole basis of the capitalist system, because capitalism cannot survive if the vast majority of people think the system isn't working for them. And
Indeed. Yeah.
and that I saw that this when in my time in the Soviet Union and most recently in China, when people don't believe in the system, it's going to crash. And
Hmm.
that's what's happening in Canada, the US, and Australia.
Okay. So there's a certain paradox here. We've got to get back to the basics. We've got to cut those regulations, open up land well, be able to bring housing affordability to the middle class, the working class. And ironically, if we don't do that, it gets into a kind of a lack of trust or confidence that the system is working for them, Joel, if I'm
Exactly.
hearing you correctly, right?
Yeah.
And
I mean, look, we in the United States, which is the world capital of capitalism, if you will, a majority of young people are favorable to socialism. Where do you think that came from?
yeah, right.
The universities and then lived experience
Hmm.
when they graduate.
Okay, so we've got to pay attention here. There's a lot of comments. Um, the other side to this is crony capitalism is what works for those left liberal countries, and that's from Chris McLaughlin. And speaking of which, you may recall that in the headlines of the news stories, I referenced a fascinating story, Marco, about the condo purchasing,
Oh,
the introduction of federal provincial dollars to buy condominiums. There's thousands and thousands of condominiums in the lower mainland alone as the real estate market has imploded for many reasons. But you have a whole series of public monies now being used to buy up this is under the guise that somehow this is going to help housing affordability. I mean, is this not the definition of crony capitalism, Marco? Does this not raise flags about this is the exact wrong thing or policy we should be doing is using public money to, well, buy out condominiums?
The the idea that people should own their own homes is not just a fantasy of capitalism. It is in many ways the basis of our liberal societies.
right.
We emerged out of the Middle Ages, where there were entire sections of the population that did not have access to property. And the transformation of the capitalist system is that it allows just about anyone with a little hard work and a little ingenuity to find the means to buy their own property.
Mhm.
And furthermore, it also strengthens the very foundations of what we know to be the democratic system, because it makes people less dependent on the state.
Mhm.
And so this idea that we should buy condos, that the government should buy condos with our money to supply to people um, outside the market, is so ridiculous that if we really examine the foundation of what they're doing, you would think that their goal is to make people more dependent and not more independent.
Mhm.
But at bottom, here's what's going on, right? There are the developers built thousands and thousands of these units expecting to sell them, and they're not selling them.
Mhm.
Right.
And so people need houses, but they don't want those houses. People need places to live, but they don't want those dwellings. So the government is going now to buy with the people's money uh, the housing units that people don't want to buy.
Mhm.
In a regular system of free markets, the prices of things people don't want to buy would come down, And then some people might decide, well, it's not so bad after all because the prices have come down. The government is trying to offer a remedy for a market deficiency that the market is already trying to correct.
Mhm.
Uh, and so this is what is so ridiculous. To boot, of course, it is no help to the regular person, even to the person who's going to live there, because we are acquiring even more debt at a time in which the country is indebted up to its eyeballs. So it just
Mhm.
makes no sense from any particular point of view, except for the fact that the government actions, in this case the federal government and the provincial government of British Columbia, are going to rescue developers for their poor decision making or for the market downturns or whatever it is that is causing
Mhm.
those units not to sell. But that's not the government's job. The
Mhm.
government's job is not to correct the market in that way.
Well said. So, government, please keep out of this. That's bad public policy. It begs serious questions. Who does that serve? So,
And David, they also maintaining the price of these units elevated, which is the opposite of
mhm,
what they
Oh
should be
God.
doing, right? Because if you want people to be able to afford houses, you want the prices of these houses to come down. That's
right
the
on.
correction of the market.
Absolutely. I want to turn now to solutions, and I encourage people to read the report, at least the executive summary. It's on the website at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. But I want to talk about, well, we need solutions. We need more land. I think that's underlined several times. And let's talk about stopping the orthodoxy. And I think, Joel, you alluded to this at the beginning. We'll get to that in a moment. And three, the role of government, private sector, and citizens. So let's talk about the orthodoxy. That's a fancy word for what's the way of thinking, Joel, here that is among a special class. I like to call them the good and the great. Some planners, I've worked with many planners over my work on thousands of development applications, and that's no overstatement. But I do know that there's a certain planning philosophy or orthodoxy, a way of thinking that says we've got to control all this land, and by golly, we're gonna I think of Randall Toole's phrase. We want to pack them and stack them up
Right.
in high density developments. I don't know where architects' future are going to be. They all look like blocks to me. They look quite ugly. But hey, if somebody wants to live in them, great. But most people don't. So what do we mean by this planning orthodoxy, Joel? And how do we stop it?
Well, of course, its origins are in the UK, which has had influence on planners pretty much around the English-speaking world, at least. And basically, the orthodoxy is, if I could just boil it down, is the future, because of climate, we're going to need to, we can't afford to drive cars, even though you could drive electric, and we
Yeah.
will eventually be driving autonomous. Um, that every inch of space that's used up is an environmental loss. Um, and if you really go into the thinking, and you say, well, if people can't have a single family house, they're not going to have kids. These are people who don't think kids are, you're just creating a bunch of new carbon emitters,
Right.
and you certainly don't
Humans are
want to do that.
bad. We don't want human beings,
Right.
right?
And
Yeah.
except for our group. So one
Oh,
funny
yeah. Right.
story, I spoke
Yes.
to a League of Conservation Voters years ago, and this is up in the Bay Area, and the San Francisco Bay Area, and they said, well, we really got to get people to live in smaller apartments. Single family homes are bad. And I asked people in the room, by the way, where do you live? And almost every single one lived in a single family house. And the people who ran the whole thing had multiple houses.
So rules for you, rules for thee, not for me, kind of thing.
That's called neo-feudalism, as somebody wrote a book
Neo-feudalism.
about.
So, okay, so you've written a lot about this, Joel. We've talked about this before. You've got some brilliant books on this. What do you mean by neo-feudalism?
Well, I think it's Marco talked about the basis of democracy, first coming out of the Netherlands and the UK, and then in the colonies, both all three colonies, what became the United States, Canada, and Australia. The idea was that if you worked hard, you would have a chance of owning some land, And that would
Yeah.
give you some autonomy, not just from the government, but autonomy from the wealthy,
Mhm.
that you had something you controlled.
Right.
That is the principle that's being, systematically dismantled. And
Wow.
what that means is we live in a society in which the choices increasingly will be: you can have your life run by the state, like in China, or you can have your life run by a combination of the state and the corporate elite, which is what we see in the English
Okay.
speaking world.
Wow.
That's what neo feudalism is about. It is a reversion away from the tremendous democratization of land ownership that we experienced in all the
Mhm.
English speaking countries after the Second World War, and
Okay.
including, by the way,
But
under
Joel,
labor governments.
let's be clear. You're making a profound point here. And it goes back to a common phrase that people throw around. And Chris mentions this: you will own nothing and be happy, in the sense
Right.
that we're moving away from the North American dream, where you did have your house and you did have a future. You could work hard and you can accumulate capital. You can even create a business. That system served people. Like, that gives people energy, hope,
Right.
optimism, the whole bit. Now you're saying there's a regression back to kind of a medieval feudal society where most people were serfs or slaves. In fact, you could argue many people are that today. We're reverting, we're losing the dream. It's dissolving in many jurisdictions right before us. So, like, that's the summary point. So you're saying neo-feudalism, a new feudal era,
Right.
right?
And, obviously different, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't come dressed in chainmail. It's not, it's not feudalism in the old way. It's a new kind of feudalism in which, if you take a look at the concentration of wealth and the concentration of the ownership of property,
Mm.
um, you can see that we're reverting back to a paradigm that is modern, but also is an echo of the past. And
Wow.
it's particularly scary, as Aldous Huxley pointed out, that you can achieve a technologically enabled dictatorship essentially over people's lives, and it would be very hard to reverse. Um,
Unbelievable.
so that's where I think all this
Mhm.
is heading. The good news is there's resistance to this idea, um, and there's and human desire still
Mhm.
can maybe overcome bad policy.
Okay, so Marco, you're political science. Your your title doctor means something. What are the implications of this for, well, list them off, including democracy?
Well, the most the most obvious one, of course, is the one we have seen in the last few years, that people who are more and more dependent on the largesse of government, on social programs and the like, are the least likely people to stand up for their rights. And as the public space continues to shrink by all kinds of different policies, including, for example, the curtailing of free speech
Mhm.
and free expression and all those things. Whereas the people who are most likely to stand up to those things are either people who came from somewhere else and have seen the ugliest possibilities, people who came from places like the Soviet Union or China or Eastern Europe or what have you, and or people who still have some independence. If you look at the people, for example, who resisted the COVID lockdowns, by and
Mhm.
large, they were sort of independent business people. They were farmers and whatnot,
Yes.
people who could
Right.
sustain themselves on their own. But if you had a government job, or if you worked for a university, or such things, you did not have the freedom to exercise your rights, because you'd lose your job and you'd lose your house and you could lose your family.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
the implications of this sort of slow restriction for property is also a restriction on the very independence that citizens in a free society rely on.
Okay. Wow. There you got it. So this policy matters not only to your standard of living, but to really everything. Because if you don't have the ability to move forward, then you are ultimately losing not only your prosperity, but your freedom, really. And I want to talk then about role of government. And I want to bring up a slide, Madam Producer, that talks about urban containment and the relationship with affordability. I was just in Ottawa and I took a tour of the city. I behaved like a tourist, even though I've been there, I don't know how many times. And it was interesting because one of the commentaries in the double-decker bus as we toured around the city talked about they were so proud of their green belt, Joel, their green belt. And I looked at this and I looked at the real estate prices in fancy neighborhoods in Ottawa. And I know that Frontier's done research on the city of Ottawa, among other cities. But I was astounded by all this land available. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy forests and all the rest. But it was like, this is just an example of that graph. You've got these green belts all over different cities. And it's not to say you don't have parks, but you have to have also places for people to live, Joel. I mean, are we so blinded by ideology that we can't see ourselves to have compassion, to have places for people to live and have a future for the next generation? What is going on here?
Well, of course, it depends how you define we.
Oh yeah, you nailed it.
I mean, if I'm in a very secure job, if I'm in my 40s or 50s, I bought my house, 20, 30 years ago. I have a steady job. I have a big pension. System works great for me. If we means a young person who's trying to make it in the world, that's a very different story. That person is really in many cases, either going to have to move or is going to have to accept a standard of living far below what their parents had. That is a very, very dangerous situation for any society.
And why is that dangerous, Joel?
Because people feel that the system has failed them, and they're going to look for some other way of doing things. Mm-hmm. If I have no chance of buying a house, why should I care about home ownership? What I really care about is rent. And if you look at what's happening in the United States and many of the big cities, I just finished a piece about this, you can almost directly correlate the level of support for the socialists in the United States to how many people are renters.
Okay.
I mean, in almost every race that I've looked at, when you move into an area where a lot of people are homeowners, they don't vote for socialists. They may be Democrats. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in Canada, they may be liberals, but they don't want socialism. But if you're a young person and you've been indoctrinated in the in these, what somebody called them the gateway drug to becoming a Marxist is going to college. You have a very different view of the world, and I think that what we're seeing is that that there's a class of people who benefit from the system. There's a class of people who don't benefit from the system, and within that group, there's going to be a group who's going to say, what, I'm going to live on a $3,000 a year, a $3,000 a month guaranteed income. I'm going to have rent that's stabilized and maybe even subsidized, and I'm going to go to the government grocery store if I live in New York City. And we're creating a whole different kind of human being, very different from the people who built Canada, built Australia, built the United States, and built the United Kingdom.
Wow. There you have it. Great summary, Joel, and very profound insights there. So, Marco, I know that we're going a little bit over time in terms of our program, and Wendell did a fantastic job on this report. And I guess one of the takeaways for me is the question, what can citizens do when we look at this situation? I mean, I think what both you and Joel, and of course Wendell through the report here, has really represents a clarion call for reform to our land use system and the need to get on with the program to get housing affordability developed in a number of these key markets. What can citizens do? Are there any lessons or advice you have there?
Look, 20 some years ago, when Wendell began to do this, you might have argued that the idea of tying average income to average price was kind of theoretical and pseudo intellectual. You would have or might have argued that he was maybe off the reservation on the idea that policies and bad policies drive this thing. 20 some years later, we have plenty of examples that have essentially verified his theory, and so the antidote really is for people to demand of the representatives better policies.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between Vancouver and Edmonton isn't just geography, and is certainly not fate.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is the policy that drives the market, and that either obstructs the market to buy better and more affordable units, or the opposite. And
Mm-hmm.
so the fundamental answer, and there are many, and there are many issues who drive this, it's not the only one, but the most basic one is that we need to make sure that the rules diminish, that the rules don't drive the rules don't become obstruction, that the rules facilitate the
Mm-hmm.
ability of the market to build more product for people who need it.
Well said. Joel, what's your advice? What's the role of citizens here?
Well, I think they have to be in a position where they challenge these policies. Again, in some parts of the United States, it's not even a debate. The market
Mm-hmm.
is, people who live in Missouri or live in most of Texas, they say, well, it's the market.
Mm-hmm.
And if some guy goes and builds a bunch of high-rise buildings and 30 miles from downtown Houston, and he gets wiped out, well, that's the way the game should be played.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is really, where citizens have got to say, we not only do I want something, and this is from some of the focus groups we've done, not only something for themselves, but something for their children. There's nothing sadder than hearing a parent saying, my kids will never be able to live in a house like mine. They're not going to be even able to live in the same state.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought as a kid growing up in New York that would be what that my parents would say, oh, well, you'll never be able to have a house like ours, and
Mm-hmm.
you'll be a renter for the rest of your life. You impose that on people, and you're committing something that's very anti-democratic, and also I think something that's going to destabilize the society.
I agree. So this is a profound discussion, and I'm so glad we could have it today with our guests, Marco Navarro-Genie, as well as Joel Kotkin. And Wendell Cox, of course, we want to thank him for the lead on this important report. I encourage people to read it. So thank you very much, Marco and Joel.
Well,
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank our audience for joining us today as well. We've had quite a conversation. Your comments are much appreciated. And we hope that as much as this is a challenging topic, that this also gives you a sense of hope and solutions. And you can check us out every week on Thursday, the live edition on these channels, including on YouTube and across Merit TV Canada from coast to coast. And I also want to encourage you to think of a special event that's coming up about reclaiming the North, about strategic utility corridors, and that's about our sovereignty. And we've got some big name speakers. And we've also, that's September 14, 15 in Winnipeg. And this is all about rebuilding our country. And we think this could be a game changer as we think about energy and economic opportunities for our country. So be sure to check that out. You'd be very welcome. It'd be great to see you in person. But again, I want to thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week on Thursday in the live edition on Leaders on the Frontier.
Here at Frontier, we don't receive any government funding. We are nonpartisan, and we work for you. Find out more and support this important work by visiting fcpp.org today.